Hi everyone! As promised, I wanted to film myself kind of chatting through the last few slides of this Nearpod because I think this topic is really important and also pretty interesting to think about. So we last left off talking about this free response question here, and again, the whole point of this is to say that you should really focus on the big ideas here and then practice applying them to lots of different scenarios, right? Like there's no way that we would be able to talk about every single little detail in this class, including tires, right? But if you have a good foundation on what landfills are, what happens when you burn things, pollutants and chemicals that get released into the air, if you know about pathogens and how those are affected with the environment, all of those things can help you answer this question without actually knowing specifically about tires, right? And so I'm going to encourage you to, when you study both for the final and for the AP exam, please don't be worried about these like specific examples that you might see that you have never heard of before. Really think back to the bigger picture and what can you use from your AP Environmental Science knowledge to apply to these questions and things like that. Okay, so continuing on, we talked about landfills. We talked about one solution to the environmental concerns of leaching and gas of methane, like leaking out, right, is sanitary landfills. But this also leads to this question of, well, what do we do with all of this e-waste? And it's not that much, right? In our pie chart, that was kind of part of the miscellaneous section. It's only 2% of our waste stream, but if you remember that photograph of all of those phones that get thrown away, all of these computers, all of these random things, electronics, get thrown out. And unfortunately, these are really hard to deal with, right? Recycling is a big issue. They often have a lot of toxic components like these things, right? So just thinking about a typical computer, mouse, keyboard, that sort of thing. You might find things like lead and arsenic and selenium and all of these things, cadmium, chromium, cobalt, mercury, in just these electronics, right? And with the way that we recycle through all of our electronics so quickly, right? Things break very easily. We know that phones don't last very long anymore. They aren't really made to last necessarily. So all of that stuff ends up somewhere, and that usually is the landfill. However, in case you didn't know this, you are not supposed to toss e-waste, electronics, and stuff like that in your actual garbage, your trash. You should take it to a particular center. So here in El Cerrito, we have one that is like right nearby, and you can sort all of your different wastes there. There's place for e-waste, there's different types of plastics, there's lots of different things, batteries, stuff that normally maybe you wouldn't be able to sort very well in your own home, but at the El Cerrito Recycling Center on the hill, right, like it makes it possible to do that. And similarly here, check out iPhone, same thing. You've got a lot of different types of chemicals that you're going to find, right, just in these electronics, in your button, in the circuit board, in the processor, in your case even. And these are pretty substantial amounts too. Okay, so interesting thing here. Thankfully, in the US, we cannot dump our waste into the ocean, right? Prior to 1972, that is a thing that could happen. However, in 1972, the US created the Ocean Dumping Act. You can also search for it under MPRSA. And basically it just said like, we cannot throw our trash into the water. Hence, we have so many landfills right now. Right, but this is great because now we have less of our trash that's going into the ocean. However, countries like China, Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, they still dump into the water, into the ocean. And those 5 countries alone dump more into the ocean than the rest of the entire world combined, which is crazy, crazy to think about, right? So my family in the Philippines and Vietnam, like, they ain't doing so hot with this. Just to put this into perspective, right? Just 4 years before this act came out in 1968, there were 38 million tons of dredged material, 4.5 million tons of industrial waste, 4.5 million tons of sewage sludge, and 0.5 million tons of construction debris were all dumped into the ocean. That 1 year, right? And then also between 1946 and 1970, lots of containers of radioactive waste were dumped into the ocean. So we have this act, the Ocean Dumping Act, to thank for stopping us continuing to do that, because obviously that was not on the right track. But we're still dealing with the repercussions. Okay. And if we were in class, we would do this collaborate board on why do you think environmental laws started popping up in the 60s and 70s, right? We saw in the graph earlier that we didn't do so hot even until really the 80s or 90s in terms of recycling. And you notice that the Ocean Dumping Act, was made in 72, right? And you'll notice that a lot of environmental legislation is actually somewhere between the 60s and 80s. A lot are happening in the 70s. Well, why is that? Well, I don't know if y'all know this, but the environmental movement, the way that we know it today, hasn't been around for that long. Actually, the very first Earth Day was only about 50 years ago. 1970 was the first Earth Day. And it wasn't until really the 60s and 70s that we started paying attention to the environment, right? Before then, it didn't matter if factories were polluting the air, didn't matter that we were throwing stuff into the ocean. All of that stuff nobody cared about until a few select people started talking about it and making some noise, right? So you got people like Henry David Thoreau, who started writing about nature and the wilderness. And you've got Rachel Carson, who wrote her book called Silent Spring, talked about all of the effects of this pesticide called DDT and how it's harming humans, right? If it wasn't for those individual people who started to get this idea on people's radar, we probably would not have this environmental movement that we do today. So really, what we know as the environmental issues and thinking about them didn't really start until pretty recently, right? Maybe they started when your parents were born, when my parents were born. That's how new this environmental movement is. Cool. And then one of the last final things that I want you to think about when we're talking about waste is, well, okay, we know that we have all of this landfill stuff. The way that we store waste right now is not super great. We've got leachates, we've got gas. Burning it is not super great. We can't dump it in the ocean, can't blast it off into space, lots of different things, right? But take a look at this thing called the life cycle analysis, or also known as the cradle to grave analysis. Like, this is basically thinking about not just the waste part, so like after an item's use, then we throw it away, but really it's all of the things in that process of it coming to life, to becoming a material. So all of the materials and energy from extracting and processing and distributing and using it and disposing of it, all of those things require materials, energy, resources, right? So the new way to think about waste is not just looking at the end where we talk about disposal, but instead, how can we reduce it throughout the life cycle of an entire thing, right? I posted on the Google Classroom a link to this video called The Story of Stuff. It's great. I highly recommend that you watch it. I usually share this with you all in class, but we don't have time this year, unfortunately. So check it out. It talks a lot about this kind of whole life cycle of a thing. Cool. And again, this is a similar idea, just looking at it in terms of a diagram, right? So the life cycle stage includes everything from getting the raw materials, manufacturing it, using it, possibly recycling it, managing the waste, and so on. Then it talks about, well, yeah, the waste itself releases methane, right? But what about all the other parts on the way? So basically, if we just used less stuff, right? If we made less stuff, if we were less materialistic, we could knock out more of these because we're knocking out entire areas of the life cycle stages. So think about that. If you've ever wanted to research something called minimalism and the life of being a minimalist, that's really interesting too. I think there's also some documentaries and whatnot on Netflix too, which I think are really interesting. Cool. So the last few things, the last two slides, I think, of this Nearpod, I wanted you to check out sewer systems and how they work. So there is a website that I wanted you to check out. Where does the sewage come from? What is a sewage system? How does it get to treatment plants? And how does it work? And specifically thinking about these different parts with primary and secondary treatment. And like, how do we treat all of the sewage and the sludge that goes from our home and then ends up into a sewage plant, right? So when you get the chance to, I would highly recommend just doing a quick search on like, how does sewage work? Why does it work? What are the parts to like treating this sludge and this wastewater? And then maybe like thinking about, is it good? Is it bad? Is this process good or bad? Are there ways that we can improve it? Right, and then the final thing is, well, what if we don't have a sewer system, right? What if we don't live in the city? What if we live in a rural area and you have to have your own kind of septic tank and deal with your own waste in that way? So again, there was an article here that I wanted you to check out, how your septic tank works. And similarly, I wanted you to just see, how does it work? What does it look like? What are the pros and cons, do you think, of what a septic tank might have or how it might work or what it might do? Right, so again, if you have the time, check this out. I will add in these links to the video as well so that you can take a look at all of those. Cool. And then finally, most important thing is to reflect on all the things that we talked about today. So everything from our consumption and the different types of materials that end up in our trash and our waste. Everything from what gets recycled to what doesn't, and what percentages of things get recycled. We talked about the outrageous stats of how quickly we use things and go through things. We talked about landfills, the problems with landfills, the kind of sanitary landfill, which is our current solution to our not so great landfills. And then we talked a little bit about different types of waste, ocean dumping, e-waste, that sort of thing. So hopefully you found something that was interesting, that stood out to you, and feel free to reach out to me if you have any other questions. Cool. Thanks y'all for listening.